Thanks, Josh. Several of the people in my row who are all eager to ask you a question are part of a delegation of Cuban reporters who are here. Could you give us a little bit of a backstory on this visit? Were you trying to send a message? And to your knowledge, when's the last time a White House press secretary took a question from a Cuban reporter?
I'm not sure when the last time that was, so maybe I'll give one of them the last question. It's my understanding that there are a number of Cuban journalists who are in Washington today to cover the ongoing meetings over at the State Department between U.S. diplomats and Cuban diplomats who are seeking to normalize the relations between our two countries. But if there's someone in the back that, yes, this young lady.
Thank you very much. I'm from Cuban National Television.
Excellent. Welcome to the United States and to the White House.
Thank you very much. Two small questions. First, do you think that is it possible to see in the scenario in which we will open embassies in Havana and Washington, in that future scenario, is the administration committed to be more respectful of the Vienna Convention towards the behavior of the American diplomats in Havana, for example? Do you think the programs for regime change will go on or not? Do you have any remarks on that? And on the other way, do you think that President Obama will also continue using his executive prerogative to expand the links, the bonds with Cuba?
Well, the president did state back in December when he made the announcement about the change in our Cuban policy, his intention to work in coordination with the Cuban government to open a U.S. embassy in Cuba and a Cuban embassy here in the United States. That is the intention, and that's what the diplomats who are meeting today are discussing. That would be an additional step on the road toward normalizing relations between our two countries. One of the many sticking points in those conversations has been rules that govern the activities and movement of U.S. diplomats in Cuba. And so we'll leave it to them to resolve those differences in those negotiations to make sure that we come under an agreement that will allow U.S. diplomats in Cuba to do what U.S. diplomats do in countries around the world, which is to not just engage the leaders of the government, but also to engage the people. And in this case, we would welcome the opportunity for U.S. diplomats to have the opportunity to engage more freely with the Cuban people, including Cuban citizens living outside of Havana. That there's an opportunity for U.S. diplomats to meet with Cubans who may not be a part of or even supportive of the Cuban government, and having that kind of freedom and ability to engage the Cuban people is an important part of our relationship between the United States and Cuba. And that is what those negotiations are seeking to resolve. As it relates to additional steps that can be taken, nothing that I can announce from here, but the United States and President Obama in particular, as he has expressed directly to President Castro, is interested in breaking down some of the barriers that remain between our two countries. And he believes that the interests of the United States are greatly enhanced by that there's an important Cuban market for U.S. goods that would allow U.S. Companies to benefit from that kind of relationship. But also the President believes that greater engagement between the United States and Cuba would bring about the kind of change that we would like to see in terms of the Cuban government's treatment of the Cuban people. We continue to have significant concerns about the way that the Cuban government all too often fails to respect the basic universal human rights that we hold so dear in this country. That there are too many Cuban political activists, Cuban journalists, who see their freedom of speech, their freedom of assembly, their freedom of expression trampled by the Cuban government. That continues to be a source of significant concern, not just on the part of the President of the United States, but by a lot of Americans. And it is our hope that greater engagement between the United States and Cuba will help the Cuban people and the Cuban government understand how important it is to respect those basic universal human rights.
And do you think that kind of change will go on underground like it has been done until now, or will it more openly, more publicly? You've changed the ways in which that kind of change that you want to see, your government wants to see in Cuba. Would you say that that would be more open? And do you think that it's possible to see President Obama in Havana before 2016?
Well, I know that there's one person in particular that hopes President Obama will be in Havana at some point in the at some point in the relatively recent future, and that's President Obama himself. I know that he would relish the opportunity to visit the island of Cuba and Havana in particular. As it relates to the way in which this change in Cuba will be brought about, I think that's something that the Cuban people will determine. I think we would hope, and our aspirations for the Cuban people, is that they would be able to express their views and even express their dissent in public without fear of retribution. That's a freedom that most Cubans do not enjoy at this point. But we're hopeful that by making a change in this policy, by facilitating deeper engagement between the U.S. and Cuban people, that kind of freedom of expression will become more common, and most importantly, will finally be protected by the Cuban government in a way that it isn't now. All right? Thanks, everybody. I'm going to see if I can get to this cabinet meeting late.